President.
Senator from Texas.
Mr. President, since 1790, the Coast Guard, our nation's oldest continuous seagoing service, has been the world's premier force in maritime safety, security, and stewardship. Guided by its core values of honor, respect, and devotion to duty, the Coast Guard is a symbol of resolve to our adversaries and of hope to those in peril at sea.
That's amazing.
Our nation relies on more than 50,000 members of the Coast Guard each day to keep our country safe, to project national power, and to champion the rule of law and governance on our waters and beyond. In Texas, Coast Guard members are on patrol 365 days a year. From Station South Padre Island to Sector Houston, Galveston, and beyond, Coast Guard members keep our citizens and our country safe.
He should be embarrassed.
Just this week, a Coast Guard Air Station Houston helicopter crew completed a daring rescue, saving the life of a mariner 10 miles off the coast of Galveston, Texas. When our nation calls, the Coast Guard is always ready to answer. As the ranking member of the Senate Commerce Committee, which has responsibility for policies affecting the Coast Guard and Coast Guard service members and their families, I believe that in the event of a shutdown, the Coast Guard must be paid, without question and without delay.
Well spoken, sir.
That's why last week I introduced the bipartisan Pay Our Coast Guard Act, which would treat Coast Guardsmen the same as all other service members for purposes of pay and benefits if there's a lapse in appropriation.
Not a joke.
If a continuing resolution is not passed, the prudent thing to do, the right thing to do, is to agree now that we will pay the men and women of the Coast Guard. That's what this bill does. If there's a shutdown, military personnel from all branches of the armed forces will keep working. In past shutdowns, Congress acted swiftly to pay our troops. But since the Coast Guard is housed in the Department of Homeland Security and not the Department of Defense, Coast Guardmen were left out. They weren't compensated. Our bipartisan legislation, which I introduced along with Senators Cantwell, Sullivan, and Baldwin, avoids that scenario by saying if there is a shutdown, all of our armed forces, including the Coast Guard, must be paid. This bipartisan bill makes clear here and now that we will not take the Coast Guard hostage to a shutdown fight. While the American people can always count on the Coast Guard has not been always able to count on this chamber to do the right thing. During the last government shutdown, which was precipitated by the Democrat majority in this chamber, in 2019, members of a single branch of our armed forces, the Coast Guard, worked without paychecks for 34 days.
Hey, y'all, come look at this.
Oftentimes alongside service members of other branches who were still being paid. The Defense Department was funded, but the Homeland Security Department was not. So I joined with several Senate colleagues to advance a bill that would have treated members of the Coast Guard the same as those in the Air Force, the Army, the Navy, and the Marine Corps. That bill was brought up before the entire U.S. Senate, but it was blocked by the Democratic leader. The only thing necessary to ensure timely payment of every Coast Guard service member was for my colleagues across the aisle to withdraw their objection. Regrettably, that did not happen. While Coast Guardsmen put their lives in danger protecting our maritime borders, some of their families were forced to resort to food pantries and short-term loans to pay for housing. We have the opportunity today to get that right. Last month, we marked the 233rd birthday of the Coast Guard. To commemorate the occasion, this chamber unanimously passed a resolution that I introduced honoring the Coast Guard's excellence in maritime border security. The resolution also expressed the Senate's gratitude for the Coast Guard's work in protecting our people and our borders from illegal immigration and keeping deadly drugs like cocaine and fentanyl from entering the United States. Again, that resolution passed the Senate unanimously in July. I hope to see similar unanimous support for the Coast Guard from my colleagues today. Let's not wait until we know if there's going to be a shutdown or not to make sure that Coast Guardsmen are treated fairly and equitably. Let's act now to show the Coast Guardsmen who keep us safe that we've got their back as well. Let's do the right thing by making clear that if we pay our Department of Defense troops, we're also going to pay our troops from the Coast Guard.
No, it's not.
At this point, I want to yield to my colleague, Senator from Alaska, Senator Sullivan.
Mr. President,
Senator from Alaska.
well, I want to thank my colleague and friend, Senator Cruz from Texas, where he has presented our bill, the Pay Our Coast Guard Act, which he noted is a bipartisan bill in the Commerce Committee. The chairman, the ranking member, I am the ranking member on the subcommittee in charge of the Coast Guard. The chair of that committee, Senator Baldwin, is also a co-sponsor of this bill. Senator Cruz laid it out really well. This is a very simple bill. The men and women who protect our coastline, who protect our country, who are in the military, who I see working so hard, risking their lives day in, day out in Alaska, where we have some of the most members of the Coast Guard stationed in our great state than almost any other state. They need to be protected, and they need to know the United States Senate has their back.
Hey, that's pretty good.
Now, it's kind of hard to believe what Senator Cruz just mentioned, but let me repeat what happened in 2019. When there was a partial government shutdown, every branch of the U.S. military, the Army, the Navy, the Marine Corps, the Air Force, they all got paid. They all got paid, with one exception, the Coast Guard.
Don't change the subject.
Imagine how you felt if you were in the Coast Guard, watching your brothers and sisters in the other services getting paid, and you weren't.
Mm-hmm.
There were operations going on in the Persian Gulf where members of the Marine Corps, the Navy, and the Coast Guard were doing joint operations against Iranian aggression, and one of those members on those ships and boats wasn't getting paid, the Coast Guard members. So this happened, Mr. President, in America. As a matter of fact, the Commandant of the Coast Guard at the time, Admiral Carl Schultz, said, quote, "This marks the first time in our nation's history that service members in a U.S. armed force have not been paid during a lapse in government appropriations."
Sure, I know what you're thinking. He's a weirdo.